It is the 16th of June 1940. France is in dire crisis. 2 weeks earlier, the last of the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk, and soon afterwards, Paris was occupied by German troops. Facing such a situation, yet being unwilling to surrender to the Germans, the Prime Minister of France, Paul Reynaud, resigns. His replacement is a national hero of the First World War. Yet, in the days that follow, he will quickly organize surrender terms with the Germans and set up a collaborationist government which he heads from the town of Vichy. Over the next 4 years, he will jettison his status as a national hero and become one of France's foremost villains. His name? Marshal Philippe Pétain, the French hero who became a traitor. The man known to history as Philippe Pétain was born on the 24th of April 1856 in the small village of Cauchy-à-la-Tour in the department of Pas-de-Calais in northern France. His full baptismal name was Henri-Philippe Benoni Omer Pétain. His father was Omer Venant Pétain. He was a local farmer of Belgian heritage. The Pétains were among the wealthier peasants in Cauchy, and during the 1840s, Omer briefly worked as an apprentice with Louis Daguerre, the pioneering photographer who gave his name to the daguerreotype camera. Omer abandoned his ambitions of opening his own studio after the Revolution of 1848 and returned home to the family farm. In February 1851, he married Clotilde Alexandrine Legrand. 8 years younger than her husband, Clotilde came from a family of similar economic and social status. By the time Philippe was born, his mother had already given birth to 3 daughters. The arrival of a boy was particularly welcomed by Omer, who finally had a son to help out on the family farm that he would also one day inherit. In the century before Pétain's birth, France had witnessed considerable political turmoil. The constitutional monarchy established by the French Revolution in 1789 quickly gave way to a more radical republic in 1792, only for Napoleon Bonaparte to take power as first consul in November 1799 and proclaim himself Emperor of the French in 1804. Napoleon's final fall in the summer of 1815 led to the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in the person of King Louis XVIII. After Louis's death in 1824, his brother Charles X was toppled in July 1830 by his cousin Louis-Philippe of Orléans. Nicknamed the Bourgeois King, Louis-Philippe's initial popularity gradually drained away, and he was toppled in the series of revolutions which spread across Europe in 1848 and which ushered in the Second French Republic. This republic was also short-lived and was again toppled by a Bonaparte after Napoleon's nephew, Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, was first elected as president in 1848 and then, in a mirror performance of his uncle, declared himself as emperor 4 years later in 1852. Emperor Napoleon III ruled down to 1870. It was a reign of extremities. On the one hand, he had destroyed the nascent Second French Republic, but on the other hand, he did begin revitalizing France as an international power, building up its imperial presence in Africa and the Far East, while also establishing considerable French influence in Mexico, for a brief period of time in the 1860s. Political change was accompanied by economic change, and the Industrial Revolution really began to take off in France in the middle of the 19th century, especially so in northern cities like Lille, not far from where Pétain grew up in the Pas-de-Calais. While the Pétains were better off compared to most farmers, work on the farm was hard, and the diet largely restricted to soup and bread. Life got even harder for the family when Philippe's mother died in October 1857 while giving birth to a short-lived daughter. His father remarried in 1859. When he was 5 or 6 years old, Philippe and 2 of his elder sisters were sent to live next door with their paternal grandparents. His other surviving sister went to live with their maternal uncle, the Abbé Legrand, at his vicarage in Beaumy, 10 kilometers away. The priestly establishment was far more impressive than the family farm, and Philippe regularly visited Abbé Legrand, who took charge of his education. Also of interest at Beaumy was his grand-uncle, Abbé Philippe Michel Lefebvre, a retired clergyman who had fought in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. In the years before his death in 1866, the elderly abbé regaled young Philippe with tales of his wartime experiences. While several of Pétain's biographers argue that his grand-uncle's stories encouraged him to pursue a military career, the Abbé Legrand appears to have been a more influential figure in Philippe's childhood. In 1866, the 10-year-old Philippe left Cauchy to train as a priest at Saint-Omer. The college Saint-Bertin there was a prestigious institution, and Pétain could only afford to attend with the benefit of a legacy from the late Abbé Lefebvre. After 3 years of instruction in classical languages and religious studies, Pétain began his 5-year baccalaureate in 1870. His academic record at Saint-Bertin was solid, without being spectacular. Although he became extremely dedicated to the Catholic faith while there, when he finished his studies, Pétain opted for a career in the army rather than the church. A motivating factor may have been France's disastrous defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, which had led to the fall from power of Napoleon III and the birth of the Third French Republic in its aftermath. Pétain left Saint-Bertin in 1874. In 1875, he received his uncle's backing to enroll in the college Albert Legrand at Arcueil. The institution was run by Dominican monks who operated on the principle that a combination of religious devotion and sporting excellence were essential qualities for students seeking to enter France's military academies. Pétain was diligent in his studies, became an able horseman, and emerged as a leader of his peers on parades, but after taking the examinations for the Military Academy of Saint-Cyr in 1876, he ranked 403rd out of the 412 admitted. While the old aristocratic families had ceased to dominate the elite military academy as before, Pétain's social inferiority at Saint-Cyr was even more obvious. Nevertheless, he settled in well at the academy, and by the time he graduated in 1878, he was ranked midway in the year. Still, the result was not enough for Pétain to join the cavalry, and he was forced to choose the less prestigious infantry instead. Many of his peers chose to serve overseas and fight in colonial wars in Africa and Asia, but Pétain preferred to remain in France, and in early 1879 he was posted to the 24th Battalion of Chasseurs Alpins at Villefranche-sur-Mer, near the Italian border. While the French army had lost little of its self-belief after the Franco-Prussian War, there was little soldiering for Pétain to do at Villefranche, though he enjoyed climbing the mountains with his men and led a training program in alpine warfare. As an energetic officer in his mid-20s, Pétain and his friend Alphonse Guide also enjoyed gambling and chasing after local women. One of the women Pétain courted was the mother of his future wife, Eugénie Ardon, though little Nini was only 4 years old at this stage of their acquaintance. After 4 years at Villefranche, Lieutenant Pétain bid farewell to the ladies in January 1883 and was posted to Besançon near the Swiss frontier. Now in his late 20s, Pétain decided it was time to get married. He first sought the hand of a distant cousin from home. She was not only 9 years older than him, but was very pious and sworn to celibacy. 2 more proposals to ladies in Besançon were also turned down by their fathers, seemingly on account of his poor background. Thus, he remained a bachelor for several years beyond the time he had intended. After 5 years at Besançon, he learned of the death of his father in May 1888. Within a few weeks, he had met and fallen in love with the daughter of a wealthy engineer and proposed to her. The prospective bride's father was willing to allow the match to go ahead so long as Pétain abandoned his military career and joined the family firm. The 32-year-old officer discussed the subject over several days with his uncle, Abbé Legrand, who firmly ruled that he ought to continue serving France. Since both of his parents were now dead, Pétain felt that he could not marry without the consent of his uncle, and so the engagement was called off. Philippe was now committed to his military career and enrolled in the École de Guerre, the staff college in the south bank of the Seine near the Eiffel Tower, which was then nearing completion ahead of the 1889 World's Fair. During his 2 years of study, Pétain consistently scored high marks and furthered his reputation as a leader with a firm voice of command, albeit one who was cold and detached. After being promoted to captain on the basis of seniority in July 1890, Pétain spent 3 years as a staff officer in Marseille before assuming command of a company at Vincennes near Paris in 1893. In July 1895, Captain Pétain returned to the capital and joined the staff of the military governor of Paris. Although promotion had been slow as a member of the General Staff, the 39-year-old Pétain was now part of the French military elite. A few months before his posting to Paris, a Jewish artillery officer attached to the General Staff, named Alfred Dreyfus, had been found guilty of espionage and imprisoned at Devil's Island in French Guiana. The Dreyfus affair soon became a major political issue in France, with the socialist firebrand Georges Clemenceau and the writer Émile Zola defending Dreyfus and accusing the General Staff of antisemitism. The General Staff closed ranks. While Pétain was not directly involved in the events, he shared the General Staff's prejudices and was convinced of Dreyfus's guilt. He was wrong in this conviction. By 1898, it was increasingly clear that Dreyfus was not guilty, though the General Staff falsified evidence to acquit the real culprit, Major Esterhazy, and it took until 1906 for Dreyfus to be readmitted into the ranks of the army. In 1898, Pétain was reacquainted with Nini Hardon, now an attractive lady in her 20s. He considered proposing to her, but refrained from doing so after being posted to Amiens in September. In July 1900, after a decade as a captain, Pétain was promoted to major and assigned to a battalion command in southeastern France. No sooner had he arrived there than he was redeployed as an instructor at the rifle school in Châlons. While French infantry doctrine after the Franco-Prussian War favoured offensive actions and the shock effect of indiscriminate mass fire, Pétain preferred to emphasise accurate marksmanship. His tenure only lasted 6 months, since he was at odds with the director of the rifle school, but in autumn 1901 he returned to favour and was appointed an adjunct professor at the École de Guerre. Pétain was an effective teacher, though he was in the minority when it came to infantry tactics. His return to Paris also encouraged him to formally propose to Eugénie Ardon through her stepmother and grandmother without informing Eugénie herself. When the two women turned down the proposal on her behalf, Pétain encouraged Eugénie to marry someone else, which she duly did. Meanwhile, the Dreyfus affair continued to shape French politics and the military. The left-wing Radical Party won a majority in the May 1902 elections, vowing to reduce the influence of the Catholic Church. The anti-clerical campaign targeted Catholic elements in the French army, and while Pétain stopped going to Mass on a regular basis, he continued to support the Church as an integral part of France's social fabric. As part of the reorganization, he was proposed as director of the rifle school in Châlons alongside promotion to lieutenant colonel. However, he declined the offer since he did not wish to be associated with the left-wing government. In 1904, another scandal broke out when it transpired that the Minister of War had established an intelligence network through Masonic lodges to compile files on military officers and their political loyalties. Pétain was outraged and felt vulnerable since he had no political connections, although by now he was one of France's leading military theorists and an expert not only on tactics but military history. He summarized his tactical approach in the simple phrase, "Le feu tue," firepower kills, and believed that any offensive action was futile without artillery support. After an unappealing posting to Quimper in Brittany between 1906 and 1908, Pétain returned to the École de Guerre as a full professor. He continued to broaden his intellectual horizons and delivered lectures to full audiences. Like his peers, he agreed that wars could not be won without taking the offensive, and while he favoured more caution at the tactical level, he was not opposed to Lieutenant Colonel Louis de Grandmaison's ideas of rapid mobilization of force on a wide front. Since French officers were required to rotate between staff and field roles every few years to gain experience of both, after being promoted to full colonel, Pétain was assigned to command a battalion of the 33rd Infantry Regiment in Arras, the administrative centre of his native Pas-de-Calais. Before leaving Paris, Pétain once again resumed his acquaintance with the unhappily married Nini Ardon, and he continued to visit her while being stationed in Arras. As well as working to improve morale and discipline among the 33rd, Pétain went to Belgium on an inspection tour in 1912 and recognized that they were not up to the task should a German army choose to invade France through Belgium. Upon his return to Arras, he accelerated his efforts to ensure that the 33rd was prepared for such an invasion. In October 1912, a young high flyer from the Saint-Cyr Academy named Charles de Gaulle arrived at Arras to serve under Pétain, whom he admired, and Pétain quickly recognized the young officer's abilities. In April 1914, Pétain was assigned to command the 4th Infantry Brigade, whose regiments were spread out across northern France. He opted to exercise his command from the familiar surroundings of Saint-Omer. At 58 years old, he was 2 years away from his scheduled retirement. Such plans were disrupted by news of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914. Austria's declaration of war on Serbia at the end of July triggered a series of declarations of war that pitched Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire against France, Britain, Russia, and Serbia. The First World War had commenced. Ever since the Franco-Prussian War 4 decades earlier, the French had been determined to defeat Germany in a future war and recover the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine in the east that had been lost in 1871. The French war plan, known as Plan 17, called for the rapid mobilization of units in eastern France to break through German defences in Alsace-Lorraine and march all the way to Berlin. French planners did not seriously consider the prospect of a German invasion of northern France via Belgium, since it would trigger a British guarantee to defend Belgian neutrality. The German plan, originally formulated by the late Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen, envisaged a weak defence of Alsace-Lorraine, with the majority of German forces swinging around to invade northern France via the Low Countries, attack Paris from the west, and encircle the French army in Alsace-Lorraine. Forcing France to surrender quickly was essential to ensure that German forces could be redeployed eastwards to confront the Russians. After Schlieffen's death, the new German commander, Helmut von Moltke the Younger, modified the plans by weakening the strike force in the north and reinforcing Alsace-Lorraine. Accordingly, the French offensives in the east were repulsed by devastating fire from the German defences. At the same time, the German offensive in the north was delayed by brave Belgian resistance and the landing of the British Expeditionary Force, while rapid Russian mobilization forced von Moltke to send reinforcements from the Western Front to General Paul von Hindenburg in the east. With the failure of the Eastern Offensive, the French commander-in-chief Joseph Joffre hastily revised his orders and diverted units to defend northern France. On the 5th of August, Pétain received orders to assemble his brigade at Arras and march to Kherson on the Belgian frontier, where they would join General Louis Franchet d'Esperey's 1st Army Corps to advance north. It is peculiar that at nearly 60 years of age, Pétain received his baptism of fire in war on the banks of the Meuse on the 14th of August 1914. The French suffered heavy losses against German artillery in the clash. Pétain played a substantial part in a successful rearguard action at the Battle of Guise 2 weeks later. The French army had suffered heavy losses in officers and men, and Joffre further thinned out the senior ranks by dismissing incompetent officers. Pétain was a major beneficiary, being promoted brigadier general and assigned to command the 6th Infantry Division in early September. By this point, von Moltke had redirected the German armies to the east of the French capital. During the ensuing Battle of the Marne, Pétain played a major role in driving the German line 90 kilometers to the north behind the Aisne Canal. Further French offensives were unsuccessful, but Pétain had proved his worth and was rewarded with the Légion d'honneur on the 16th of October 1914. The early months of the war otherwise vindicated Pétain's belief in the vulnerability of infantry to artillery and machine gun fire. By the end of October, both sides were exhausted from fighting and chose to hold their ground by digging their trenches deeper. Pétain's headquarters were a few miles behind the front lines and out of enemy artillery range, though he carried out regular inspections to boost morale and hosted President Raymond Poincaré's visit to the front on the 3rd of November. By December, the trench system on the Western Front extended from the Alps to the North Sea. Joffre planned a more ambitious offensive in spring 1915. Pétain's 33rd Corps spearheaded the Champagne offensive in May, but while the 33rd had taken Vimy Ridge ahead of schedule and sent the Germans reeling, the French units on either side made little progress, and Pétain was dangerously isolated. Joffre urged Pétain to press forward, but his divisions suffered heavy losses as the Germans counterattacked. He was frustrated by Joffre's demands, but it was not until the end of June that the offensive was abandoned. Pétain's relative success in the offensive earned him command of the Second Army. Joffre planned a second great offensive in Champagne for late September. Although Pétain's Second Army achieved a degree of surprise and broke through the first line of German defences on the 25th of September, they were stopped at the second line of trenches and could make no further progress. By the time the offensive was called off at the end of October, the French had little to show for 200,000 casualties. This was the bloody and often futile nature of the war on the Western Front. Over the course of 1915, Pétain concluded that the conflict was to be a war of attrition, and even Joffre recognized that the losses were too heavy. He accepted some of Pétain's recommendations on increasing production and utilization of artillery and tasked him with training 4 corps of reservists. Pétain arrived at his new headquarters at Noé, near Paris, on New Year's Eve 1915. The relative respite from the front and the proximity to the capital gave Pétain more opportunities to visit Nîmes. While the general was pursuing his romantic interests, the Germans launched a major offensive targeting Verdun. Situated on the river Meuse, the fortifications at Verdun were originally built in the 17th century by King Louis XIV's great military engineer, the Marquis of Vauban, before being upgraded over the centuries until it became the linchpin of a chain of French fortresses protecting the east of the country. With the stabilization of the Western Front, Verdun formed a salient or wedge into the German position, which was vulnerable to being cut off. The German commander-in-chief, Erich von Falkenhayn, expected the French army to defend Verdun at all costs, and hoped to inflict heavy casualties on the French defenders by attacking the salient. The Battle of Verdun became one of the most significant clashes of the whole of the war. After a heavy German bombardment on the 21st of February 1916, which was so intense it could be heard nearly 200 kilometers away, by the evening of the 24th, the Germans had broken through the French positions on the right bank of the Meuse. After meeting with his generals at his headquarters at Chantilly, Joffre decided to send for Pétain to take over the defence of Verdun and reinforce the front with the Second Army. At 10 p.m. on the 24th, a message reached Pétain's headquarters for the general to report to Chantilly at 8 o'clock the following morning. Pétain was then enjoying himself with Nini in a Parisian hotel room, and it was only in the early hours of the 25th that his aide, Captain Bernard Sarigny, arrived at the hotel and gained admission on the grounds of national security. At 7 o'clock, the two men left Paris and arrived at Joffre's headquarters at the appointed hour. Although he left Chantilly at 10, the frozen roads impeded Pétain's progress to the front, and on his way he learned that Fort Douaumont, the most imposing stronghold at Verdun, had fallen to the Germans. After spending a cold night at Souilly, where he moved his headquarters, Pétain fell ill and was diagnosed with double pneumonia. Giving orders from his sickbed, Pétain organized 3 lines of defense and ordered heavy artillery to concentrate fire on the Germans on the right bank of the Meuse. Pétain engaged an engineer on his staff, Major Richard, to improve the road to Verdun, which enabled him to rotate out exhausted units in favor of fresh ones, giving the former time to be rested and replenished before returning to action. The measures Pétain had taken to shore up the defences at Verdun proved effective, though in early April the Germans managed to take the aptly, if morbidly named, ridge of Mort-Homme, meaning dead man, part of Pétain's principal line of resistance on the left bank of the river. Effective French artillery fire and a series of counterattacks enabled Pétain's men to retake the ground over the next 2 weeks, and by early May it seemed that the Germans had lost any chance of making a concrete breakthrough. While this came as a relief, it revived tensions between Pétain and Joffre. The latter was planning an offensive with the British on the Somme and was irritated by the former's requests for reinforcements at Verdun. Pétain had become popular among the French public for his defence of Verdun, and there was no question of sacking him. In late April, he was given command of the Centre Army Group, while Robert Nivelle succeeded him as commander of the Second Army. Although Pétain was Nivelle's superior, he felt that he was being moved aside by Joffre. These changes allowed the Germans to take Mort-Homme again and the adjacent Hill 304. Then, on the 7th of June, the strategic Fort Vaux also fell to the enemy. Pétain remained in regular contact with Nivelle and persuaded Joffre to reinforce Verdun with 4 divisions, warning that without them he would have to give up the right bank of the Meuse. Further German advances were stopped, and on the 24th of June, the rumble of the British guns opening the preparatory bombardment at the Somme was heard at Verdun. While the battle continued, Falkenhayn was relieved of his position and replaced in September by Paul von Hindenburg, who ceased further offensives. Pétain worked with Nivelle to execute successful counteroffensives that retook Fort Douaumont. While Pétain was hailed as the victor of Verdun, the French had actually suffered some 470,000 casualties to the Germans' 340,000, and the general was haunted by the carnage which he had overseen. The battle had exhausted both armies and compelled the British to play a more significant role on the Western Front. the failed offensive at the Somme led to Joffre's sacking as commander-in-chief in December 1916. Pétain was justifiably aggrieved when he was leapfrogged by Nivelle for the supreme command. In early 1917, Nivelle was planning a major offensive against the Germans in the large Noyon salient between Arras and Soissons, and persuaded his British allies that a crucial breakthrough could be achieved within 48 hours. Pétain was less optimistic, particularly after the Germans received intelligence of Nivelle's plans and withdrew from the salient in March, setting up booby traps and other obstacles in the territory they had evacuated. Although his offensive no longer made strategic sense, Nivelle was determined to go ahead. Pétain raised his objections to the French government via Minister of War Paul Painlevé, but during a crucial meeting on the 6th of April 1917, President Poincaré gave Nivelle sufficient latitude to pursue his original intentions. The Nivelle offensive, which began 10 days later, failed to meet Nivelle's great expectations, and hardly any ground was gained, though casualties on both sides were roughly equal. With Nivelle's reputation in rapid decline, Painlevé offered to revive the post of Chief of the Army General Staff for Pétain. After taking office on the 1st of May, Pétain's proposals for limited offensives were accepted in high-level meetings with Allied representatives, and on the 15th of May, he formally replaced Nivelle as Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front. Although he had spent nearly 40 years in the French army without a major war to fight, the advent of the First World War had seen Pétain's meteoric ascent to become the hero of Verdun and the head of the French military. On the 17th of May, Pétain had assumed command at General Headquarters, now at Compiègne. In a gesture of goodwill towards the British, Pétain offered Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig 6 French divisions to support a British offensive at Passchendaele in Flanders. However, within days of taking command, Pétain faced the beginnings of a mutiny that would eventually involve around half of the French units on the Western Front. This was not over Pétain's leadership. Instead, it was caused by long-standing issues of inadequate supplies and lack of leave from the front. Pétain was sensitive to the men's concerns and took measures to scale back offensive action, but by early June, many mutineers were calling for an end to the war and even to overthrow the government. By mid-June, Pétain obtained Painlevé's agreement to abolish safeguards introduced after the Dreyfus affair and gave military courts sole authority to judge cases of collective disobedience. Over 500 mutineers were sentenced to death by the courts, though fewer than 50 were actually shot. Alongside these draconian measures, in mid-June, Pétain began touring the front, visiting disaffected units, promising to improve conditions. By July, the situation was under control, and French units continued to repulse German attacks. Pétain's strategy of limited offensives was bearing fruit, with the 6 French divisions under General Antoine capturing the German Third Line with minimal casualties at the Battle of Passchendaele, while offensives at Verdun and Soissons in August and October respectively were similarly successful. Pétain anticipated that the arrival of larger numbers of American troops in France would enable a general Allied offensive on all fronts in 1918, though his calculations were disrupted by the Italian defeat to the Austrians at Caporetto and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The Allies set up a Supreme War Council in November 1917, but Pétain was not part of it. Pétain's priority in the winter of 1917 was to simply hold the line on the Western Front until the Americans, who had entered the war earlier that year on the side of Britain and France, were ready for major operations by the summer of 1918. Morale in the ranks had improved considerably since the summer, and artillery pieces, tanks and aircraft were being produced at a rapid rate. With the support of Georges Clemenceau, the new premier, Pétain modified the defensive system to prioritize the second line in the German fashion. He worked closely with Haig to organize the Allied defense, but when General Erich von Ludendorff launched his spring offensive in March 1918, targeting the junction between the French and British armies, Hubert Gough's understrength Fifth Army disintegrated, allowing the Germans to make significant gains and potentially break through the French and British lines. Haig and Pétain both recognized that it was vital to maintain contact, but Haig considered Pétain too pessimistic and called for Ferdinand Foch to become the supreme commander of the Allied armies. With the Germans advancing over 40 kilometers, Clemenceau emphasized the necessity of holding on to Amiens and appointed Foch to the supreme command. Foch's counterattacks shifted the momentum, though Ludendorff continued to launch major offensives. When they advanced again in late May 1918, Paris was once again at risk. The American commander, General Pershing, agreed to help plug the gap, and the combined French, British and American forces held the line at the River Marne. While Ludendorff's offensives continued into mid-July, the worst was over, and by August, Foch was on the offensive. Pétain supported Pershing's offensive to reduce the salient at Saint-Mihiel in September. Thereafter, Foch launched 180 Allied divisions in the 100 Days Offensive, which broke the back of the German army. With defeat imminent, the German Empire began to collapse internally, and peace negotiations were quickly entered into. Pétain was slightly disappointed when the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, effectively bringing the war to an end. He had been planning an offensive in Lorraine, one of the two provinces France had lost all the way back in 1871 at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. The opportunity to be the general who reclaimed this region and advanced into Germany was one Pétain relished the prospect of, but the armistice put paid to such hopes. Still, he had emerged as one of the most accomplished generals of the war and was a hero in France, especially for his role in the Battle of Verdun. His exploits were recognized by President Poincaré, who awarded him the title of Marshal of France with the Marshal's baton within weeks of the end of the war. This was an immense honor. The office of Marshal had been used in medieval France, and a different variant was created by Napoleon Bonaparte to reward his generals during the Napoleonic Wars. However, the title had largely been dormant since the end of the reign of Napoleon III back in 1870. In granting Pétain the title, the French government was making a singular recognition of his contribution to France's victory against Germany. Pétain attended the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June 1919. Foch believed the treaty was too lenient and spoke out against the terms. This ensured Pétain's appointment as Vice Chair of the Supreme Council of War in January 1920 and Inspector General of the French Army in 1922. He married Eugénie Hardon on the 14th of September 1920. Though of retirement age, he continued as one of France's senior military commanders in the interwar period. Pétain proposed investments in tanks and aviation during these years, while also endorsing a plan for a defensive chain of fortresses on France's eastern border to protect the country against any future German aggression. In September 1925, Pétain found himself commanding an army in Morocco against the rebels from the self-proclaimed Republic of the Rif, which was threatening the Spanish and French colonial presence there. He received a hero's welcome when he visited Spain in 1926 and was awarded the Spanish Military Medal by King Alfonso XIII. Pétain had developed a greater interest in French politics in the aftermath of the First World War. As a conservative nationalist, he favoured a strong executive government to defend French values and maintain a strong military after the war. His patience with the governments of the 1920s was impacted by cuts to military spending and the reduction of national service to 1 year, following the 1925 Treaty of Locarno, which normalized relations with Germany and allowed the latter to join the League of Nations. There were other interesting developments in Pétain's affairs during these years. For instance, during this period, Pétain gave a young Charles de Gaulle, still a mere captain, the honor of delivering 3 lectures on military leadership at the École de Guerre in the spring of 1927. However, relations between the two soured when Pétain invited de Gaulle to contribute a few chapters on a book he was writing about French soldiers throughout history. Pétain found that de Gaulle's literary style did not fit with the rest of the book and invited another officer to rewrite them. In 1927 and 1928, Pétain inspected the eastern defences and set in place plans to build what became known as the Maginot Line. In February 1931, by which time Pétain was in his mid-70s, he resigned from his office as Vice President of the Supreme War Council in favour of General Maxime Weygand, Foch's Chief of Staff during the war, while General Maurice Gamelin became Assistant Chief of the General Staff. Pétain remained on the Supreme War Council and insisted on becoming Inspector General of Air Defence. The Great Depression further weakened the French economy in the early 1930s, leading to further budget cuts to the consternation of Weygand and Gamelin. In February 1934, amidst political instability in France, Pétain reluctantly accepted an invitation to join Gaston Doumergue's new government as Minister of War, a strangely late entry into national politics at 77 years of age. As contemptuous as ever of politicians, Pétain failed to persuade the Ministry of Finance to reverse budget cuts, though he managed to protect funding for the Maginot Line of defences along the eastern border. This came just over a year after Adolf Hitler and the Nazis' rise to power in Germany early in 1933. At the same time, Pétain and other French generals feared that the Germans could go round the Maginot Line and invade France via Belgium, as they had done in the First World War. Pétain hoped to encourage the Belgians to strengthen their defences on the eastern frontier with a French loan, but the idea was dropped owing to French economic weakness. The Belgians were prepared for the French army to man the defences around Liège, and the prospect of the Germans moving through the thick Ardennes forest was considered very remote. By the time Doumergue's government fell in November 1934, Pétain had achieved little of note. One of his final acts was to recommend the reinstatement of 2-year national service to address the army's manpower issues. There were good reasons for doing so. In early 1935, Hitler violated the Treaty of Versailles by announcing the creation of a German air force and the expansion of the army significantly beyond the limit of 100,000 men imposed by the treaty. In March, Hitler ordered German troops to occupy the demilitarized Rhineland, provoking outrage in France. The government approved an ambitious rearmament program in September 1936, but the increased military spending diverted funds from social reforms, leading to widespread strike action in 1937 and crippling the government, which was powerless to respond when Hitler annexed Austria in March 1938. In April 1938, Édouard Daladier replaced Léon Blum at the head of the French government. Pétain welcomed Daladier's acquiescence to the Munich Agreement with Hitler in September 1938, whereby the German-speaking Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia was given to Germany, knowing that the French army was not ready for war with Germany. In March 1939, with General Francisco Franco's victory in the Spanish Civil War all but certain, Daladier appointed Pétain as ambassador to Spain. The two men had known each other in North Africa during the Rif War, and Pétain helped to improve relations between Spain and France. He travelled extensively throughout the country and concluded that not only was Franco intent on remaining neutral in the event of a European war, the destruction caused by the Civil War meant that Spain was in no condition to fight. Pétain was still in Spain when the Second World War broke out at the beginning of September 1939. He was urgently summoned back to Paris, but refused an offer from Daladier to become Minister of War. Daladier resigned in March 1940 and was replaced by his finance minister, Paul Reynaud. To secure his parliamentary majority, Reynaud appointed Pétain as Minister of State and Vice Premier. By the time Pétain formally took office on the 18th of May 1940, the Germans had invaded France through the Ardennes, broken quickly through the French defences at Sedan, and reached the English Channel. The British were in headlong retreat towards Dunkirk. In this environment, Pétain did not offer any kind of effective military leadership. He was convinced that defeat was inevitable and that it was time to seek an armistice with Germany whereby France could maintain some autonomy over its affairs in a German-dominated Europe. The hour of his great betrayal was at hand. The Germans broke through the French defences on the Somme and the Aisne in early June. By the 10th of June, Pétain and the French government had evacuated Paris and moved south towards the River Loire. Many of the French generals were now urging Reynaud to seek an armistice to prevent the remnants of the French army from disintegrating. Pétain argued that an armistice was required to preserve the French nation and vowed to remain in France to share whatever fate awaited the French people. Others, like Charles de Gaulle, were flying out of the country to fight on from abroad in London. On the 14th, the government moved again to Bordeaux, and on the 16th, Reynaud received an offer from Churchill for an Anglo-French union with the Frenchman as head of government. Reynaud entertained the prospect, but he had lost the support of his ministers, and on the 17th of June, President Albert Lebrun reluctantly accepted Reynaud's resignation. He appointed 84-year-old Marshal Pétain in his place. Pétain now began viewing himself as the saviour of the French nation and hoped to secure the best peace agreement possible with the Germans. In a radio broadcast at noon on the 17th of June, he announced that it was necessary to cease fighting, a declaration that caused confusion among the French forces still bravely resisting the Germans, many of whom surrendered. It was only on the 19th that the Germans signalled their readiness for armistice talks. The Germans proposed the occupation of 2/3 of France, including Paris and all of the north and west, with the remaining third in the south under an independent French government. There was little room for negotiation, and the armistice was signed on the 23rd and went into effect on the 25th. Since Paris and Bordeaux were in the occupied zone, on the 1st of July, Pétain's government moved to Vichy, an old spa resort in the very centre of the country that had plenty of hotels to accommodate the ministers and their officials. Shortly before the signing of the armistice, Pétain brought Pierre Laval into his government. A former trade union lawyer, Laval had shifted to the right politically in the 1920s and served briefly as Prime Minister on 2 separate occasions in the 1930s. During the late 1930s, he was behind several schemes to establish a military dictatorship as all of Europe flirted with fascism and military corporatism. He had even envisaged at that time that Pétain might become the dictator of France, though the Marshal himself had no desire to overthrow the Republic back in the 1930s. On the 30th of June, Laval proposed inviting the deputies of the Parliament to effectively vote themselves out of existence. While Pétain was initially sceptical, Laval's cause was strengthened on the 3rd of July when Churchill ordered an attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans. The attack shocked the French nation, and even the previously Anglophile ministers in Pétain's government reckoned that it was now in France's best interests to seek closer relations with the Germans, thus endorsing Laval's proposal to abolish the Parliament. On the 10th of July, the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate met in Congress and voted 569 to 80 to disband. That evening, Pétain assumed office as head of state over the Vichy government with full executive and legislative powers. The following day, he formed a government of 12 ministers, with Laval as vice premier. Importantly, Vichy France would seek to remain neutral in the war and avoid committing to conflict with either Britain or later the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the 4 years that Pétain served as head of the Vichy regime would transform his reputation from that of a war hero to one of the villains of modern French history. In place of liberty, equality, fraternity, Pétain's government adopted the ideological formula work, family, fatherland, reflecting the Marshal's own ideas. During its early months, Pétain's government legislated to prevent Jews from holding public office and also barred them from employment in much of the private sector. This came about without any encouragement from the Germans, as Pétain and his fellow nationalists shared the antisemitic notion that Jewish industrialists and financiers aggrandized themselves at the expense of the French people. The Vichy regime was opposed by the Free French government led by Charles de Gaulle in exile in London. While there was no hope of a British and Free French invasion of France for a long time to come, France's colonies became a source of conflict. In late September 1940, British and Free French forces launched an unsuccessful attack on Dakar in Senegal, then part of French West Africa. This encouraged Pétain to seek closer military relations with the Germans. In October, Pétain met Hitler at Montoire along the border between the Nazi zone of occupation and Vichy France. While little was agreed beyond a desire to improve cooperation, a photograph of a handshake between the two men was quickly shared around the world. Churchill was appalled and threatened to bomb Vichy. Pétain was obliged to make a radio broadcast stating that Vichy France remained sovereign and independent. The diplomatic calculus changed again in November, when Britain defied French expectations to defeat Germany in the Battle of Britain. Hitler invited Pétain to Paris to attend the ceremony on the 15th of December, repatriating the remains of Napoleon's son, the Duke of Reichstadt, on the 100th anniversary of Napoleon's reburial at the Dome Church of Les Invalides. Pétain was encouraged by Laval to attend, but his moderate ministers suspected a German plot to remove him and engineered Laval's sacking. Laval's dismissal restored Pétain's popularity in France, but provoked outrage among the Germans, who tightened the screws on Vichy. By January 1941, Pétain was beginning to realize that the Germans were not prepared to treat the French as equals and viewed the Vichy government as little more than a vassal state. Moreover, while Pétain remained popular in some circles for having avoided German occupation of the Central Massif and the south, small pockets of resistance were forming across France. German influence became stronger, and a General Commission on Jewish questions was established to enforce existing antisemitic laws and devise new ones. In May 1941, Pétain's vice premier, Admiral François Darlan, allowed the Germans to use France's military bases in the Middle East. This was during a period when much of the war was focusing on North Africa and the Levant, where France had colonies like Algeria and the Mandate of Lebanon and Syria. A few months later, Pétain announced that he was the source of all political power within Vichy France and abolished political parties and political meetings. Yet, things were changing quickly in the grander scheme of things. While the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in late June 1941 met with great success initially, the advance stalled in the late autumn and the Russians began to fight back. Then, the United States allied with Britain and the USSR after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Allies committed to defeating the Germans and Italians first, and decided that they would open a front in North Africa by invading Morocco and Algeria. Thus, as 1942 dawned, and the Allies considered invading the North African colonies which the Vichy government still nominally controlled, Pétain's Vichy government was about to be pulled more closely into a war which no longer looked like it would inevitably end in German victory. By early 1942, Pétain's neutrality policy was coming under increasing pressure from both the Allies and the Axis powers. What remained of the French fleet in the Mediterranean was a vital asset that both sides were determined to get their hands on. A scheme to transfer the ships to the Vatican for safekeeping was endorsed by Pétain, but rejected out of hand by the papal nuncio. In late February, the Germans threatened to remove Pétain if he did not reinstate Laval, and in April, Laval was appointed premier with the additional responsibilities of Foreign Minister, Minister of the Interior, and Minister of Information. Laval routinely met Pétain to discuss political affairs in the evening, taking advantage of the old marshal's tiredness and frailty to ensure that Pétain would apply his signature to documents without much complaint. In July, the Vichy regime authorized the deportation of thousands of foreign Jews to death camps in Central Europe. This encouraged further opposition to the Vichy regime and damaged Pétain's image. The marshal's half-hearted protests at the deportations had little effect. Even Admiral Darlan, who retained his post as commander-in-chief, was now convinced that Germany would lose the war and began establishing clandestine contact with the Allies. This led Darlan to put up token resistance to the Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa, codenamed Operation Torch, on the 8th of November 1942. While Pétain lodged a formal complaint to the Americans, he privately welcomed the United States as a liberator of France, realizing he had made a dreadful error in 1940. Under American pressure, Darlan signed a ceasefire on the 10th of November, which Pétain endorsed in a coded message. On the 13th, the Americans recognized Darlan as the political leader in French North Africa under Vichy's nominal authority. The deal was met with outrage in the United States and Britain, and French resistance fighters eventually assassinated Darlan on the 26th of December 1942. In the meantime, German troops had marched into occupied France and taken over the island of Corsica. Some of Pétain's aides, including General Sérigny, urged him to join Darlan in North Africa and resist the Nazis. The old marshal refused, fearing either he would not survive the journey or that he would be arrested and shot by the Germans. On the 17th of November, he signed over most of his executive powers to Laval, but retained authority to declare war. While Pétain remained useful as a figurehead, Vichy was now under effective German occupation, and Laval was the new puppet ruler. In January 1943, a paramilitary organization known as the Milice was formed to hunt down Jews and communists. After the German surrender at Stalingrad in February, Pétain championed a compromise peace between the Allies and the Germans before joining forces to defeat the Soviets, and considered giving himself up to the Allies to make peace with de Gaulle. These schemes went nowhere, and over the course of 1943, the momentum shifted decisively towards the Allies as they emerged victorious in North Africa and launched an invasion of Italy. By January 1944, Pétain, whose loyalty was suspected, had effectively become a German prisoner reduced to ceremonial duties and kept under close supervision. Meanwhile, the French countryside was ablaze with fighting between the Nazi-backed Milice and the Maquis, anti-Vichy guerrilla fighters who escaped into the mountains to avoid conscription. In March, Pétain rejected an American proposal to resign as head of state and help with reconstruction after the end of the war. This was probably the last opportunity Pétain had to salvage his reputation. It is curious that he did not take the offer. In April, he went to Paris for the first time in 4 years. Initially, he was allowed to return to Vichy, but on the 7th of May, the Nazis placed him under house arrest at the Chateau of Voisin near Paris. The Allied landings in Normandy on D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, saw Pétain move to the chateau of Lanzac near Vichy. 2 months later, the Allied invasion of southern France on the 15th of August 1944 brought down the Vichy regime. Pétain was moved by the Nazis to Belfort in northeastern France, and from there to Germany itself in September. With nothing to lose, the 88-year-old Marshal refused to serve in the new government in exile. Although there was still much heavy fighting after the liberation of France, German defeat was inevitable. On the 5th of April 1945, Pétain learned that he and the entire Vichy government had been tried in absentia by de Gaulle, who was now in charge of liberated France. His demand to return to France to stand trial was refused by the German authorities, but as German military resistance crumbled, he was taken to the Swiss border on the 24th of April 1945, his 89th birthday. The Marshal crossed into France during the night of the 26th and was imprisoned at Montrouge near Paris the following morning. When his trial opened in Paris on the 23rd of July, Pétain delivered a statement asserting that he had acted to save France in 1940. He said little else in his defence thereafter. De Gaulle later reflected that the proceedings seemed like a partisan trial, and many witnesses were primarily concerned with justifying their own decision-making in 1940. While Pétain's defence persuaded several judges of his innocence, he was ultimately convicted of treason. While the death sentence was commuted on consideration of Pétain's age, he was stripped of most of his military ranks and decorations. He spent the remainder of his life imprisoned at Port Joinville on the Ile de Yeu off the Atlantic coast, where he died on the 23rd of July 1951 at the age of 95. He was denied his wish to be buried near Verdun, of which he had led the French defence during the First World War, and was instead interred in a local cemetery. Marshal Philippe Pétain is one of the most controversial figures in French history. Born into a peasant family in northern France, Pétain had a fairly unremarkable life and military career until the outbreak of World War I in 1914, by which time he was already in his late 50s. After demonstrating his leadership and tactical abilities in the early months of the war, Pétain emerged as the man of the hour during his defence of Verdun in 1916. After taking overall command of the French army the following year, he restored morale after the mutinies of 1917 and emerged from the war as a national hero in France. During the interwar period, Pétain was celebrated, but his calls for increased military spending were disregarded by the government at a time of economic difficulty. Like the rest of the French military establishment, he was shocked by the rapid German advance through the Ardennes forest in May 1940. His firm belief that Germany was set to conquer all of France led him to sign the armistice in June as Prime Minister. As head of Vichy France, Pétain enjoyed dictatorial powers and introduced right-wing policies. Although he attempted to pursue an independent foreign policy, he struggled to resist German pressure, and by late 1942 he relinquished most of his powers, but continued to serve as a figurehead for an increasingly abhorrent regime. It should probably be remembered in assessing this that Pétain was well into his 80s when all of this was occurring, and perhaps his cognitive abilities were not what they once had been. Yet this does not excuse his conduct, and he was seemingly competent enough to lead the collaborationist government. Pétain was found guilty of treason after the war and continues to be remembered primarily for his collaboration with the Germans in the Second World War rather than his heroism in the First. What do you think of Philippe Pétain? Was he a French patriot who dedicated his life to the service of his country and who believed he was doing what was necessary to save what was left of France in 1940? Or did he betray his country in order to acquire the trappings of ruling a puppet state on behalf of the Nazis? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.